B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, July 30th, 2020. An increasingly desperate Donald Trump trying to distract us from some of the worst economic numbers ever released in the United States. Floats the idea that we need to delay the November elections because of the threat to the election that is mostly in his head, driven by the idea of mail-in balloting in many states that Trump firmly believes will lead to Republican defeats. And Trump is the master of distraction. Twitter is his favorite platform for that. And the Commerce Department reported this morning that the gross domestic product dropped by nearly 10% in the second quarter and an annual rate of 32.9%. When you couple that with another 1.43 million new state unemployment claims filed in the past week, these are devastating numbers for the guy who had planned to coast to re-election on the great job he's done with the economy. Remember, we were supposed to get tired of all that winning? Are you tired yet? So what is fascinating is that the usually compliant members of the Republican legislative branches, both the House and the Senate, quickly batted down any suggestion of a delay. Mitch McConnell was at a TV station in Bowling Green, Kentucky. He said, "Never in the history of the country, through wars, depressions, the Civil War, have we ever not had a federally scheduled election on time, and we'll find a way to do that again this November 3rd. And Kevin McCarthy, House Minority Leader, said, "Never in the history of federal elections have we not held an election. We should go forward." Speaker Pelosi tweeted out the part of the Constitution, Article 2, which gives Congress the power to determine the timing of an election. And so Trump got absolutely no support for this. His tweet, with far too many all-capital words, "With universal mail-in voting, not absentee voting, which is good," he said, "2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. It will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote," followed by 3 question marks. Now, because I have been selected by Twitter to receive unsolicited tweets from the Trumpster, I know that he also tweeted out a link to a video, a clip from a CBS television station, I believe in Philadelphia, where a reporter staged a kind of mock mail-in election. And the reporter mailed 100 envelopes that were fake absentee ballots, but he mailed them to a P.O. box. And then the video shows that he went to the box every day and the envelopes trickled in. Then he asked a clerk, "Hey, where's the rest of my mail?" And it had been diverted to somewhere else in that particular post office, and they produced a big box. And the ultimate outcome of this was, according to this reporter, 3 of the 100 did not arrive within a 2-week period. But I question that the post office will misplace that many mail-in ballots. And I encourage you to listen to our fresh interview with Greg Palast, which I posted on Tuesday, where he does identify the risks of mail-in balloting, but mostly to voters whose votes may not be counted because they didn't put postage on, they didn't meet the deadline, they failed to follow all of the technicalities of signing the ballot, signing the envelope. And so, to a narrow extent, I would agree with Trump that voting by mail is not perfect. But his suggestion that it is the basis of predictable fraud is really only based on recent history of Republicans using what are called ballot harvesting techniques, and this was exposed in North Carolina's 10th Congressional District, where Republican operatives made it so easy for people to vote because they sent people to pick up the ballots from people's houses. And the ballots that they suspected or knew were from Democratic voters somehow never made it into the hopper at the election office. So Trump cannot do this unilaterally. He can't issue an executive order. He's really just desperately dreaming and scheming. And it is one thing to see the way that this is unified, Democrats and Republicans. Even over at the Fox News channel, politics editor Chris Stirewalt said this is a fragrant and flagrant expression of his current weakness. A person who is in a strong position would never suggest anything like that. So Trump may be making a tactical error here by further telegraphing his weak position in the polls and his weak position for re-election. And even Carly Fiorina, the failed former chief executive for Hewlett-Packard, who failed in a race for the U.S. Senate, which propelled her to run for president in 2016 and fail at that, well, she called this classic Trump. Quote, "He is desperately trying to distract from his failure to lead, the devastating consequences of this pandemic, and terrible economic news. It is certainly irresponsible, and I hope every elected official, Democrat and Republican alike, will stand up and say so." And this little factoid, the president has attacked mail voting nearly 70 times since late March in interviews, remarks, and tweets. He is clearly obsessed by it. But I don't believe that this is a case where he can bend reality to match his weird obsessions. John F. Harris is one of the co-founders of Politico. And in a post that was made earlier today, he is suggesting that it's time for Trump to consider the LBJ exit. Now, LBJ did it earlier. It was in March of 1968, where he concluded that he could not win re-election. And so he said that he would bow out of the campaign because he wanted to devote all of his time to ending the war in Vietnam, which, of course, didn't happen. And so Harris says it is late, but not too late to pull an LBJ. He says, but even if one doesn't really think Trump will drop out of the race, and he acknowledges that it is a stretch, it is worth examining the reasons why he just might do it. And he says that no doubt Trump would savor the validation of winning a second term, but it looks increasingly unlikely. The second question is how Trump conceives of the balance of his lifetime and his historical reputation. And I have long believed that there could be a way that Trump would snap and say, I don't want to put up with this shit anymore. He would, of course, paint himself as a victim of the media, of the Democrats, of the people who don't like his personality. And I'm sure that he would make a deal with Mike Pence that if he vacated and Pence elevated, that there would be a pardon for Trump before the end of the year. So I am not suggesting this as a likely development, but it does show that people are thinking about a parachute for the Donald. And I would love to help him strap it on. Meanwhile, he continues his incoherent and irrational efforts at campaigning. On the one hand, painting America's urban centers as scenes of violence, chaos, anarchy that require his firm grip on law and order. And at the same time, he's trying to scare the shit out of people in the suburbs that Joe Biden is going to, put up a 8-story Section 8 housing project right next to your beautiful suburban ranch house. And it's really pathetic to watch this play out. But Trump, who is a junkie for the numbers, knows that only 38% of suburban voters approve of his job performance compared with 59% who disapprove. Suburban voters disapproved of Trump's handling of recent protests and race relations by an even wider margin, and 65% had a favorable view of the Black Lives Matter movement. So he has some awareness of how deep the doo-doo is that he is mired into. But he flails around. The only way he knows to deal with this is to go negative and then to go further negative, to make up stuff. And as you know, I'm not Joe Biden's biggest fan. But the stuff that Trump has been concocting about Biden, I think is even seen as bullshit by his most ardent supporters. So last night in Portland, the federal agents were back on the street. They unloaded tear gas, projectiles, stun grenades into the early hours this morning. They drove demonstrators back several blocks. In a stronger use of force than on other recent nights, they made more arrests. Now, this could be their final bit of street theater, the last blast of their federal tear gas. Because yesterday, Oregon Governor Kate Brown, as we reported, announced that there is a deal with the feds to pull those stormtroopers out of Portland. But, of course, Trump and his hand-picked flunky, the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, they said, not so fast. We'll leave when things have stabilized and when we are good and ready. Well, early this morning, at about 5:30, the Portland Police Bureau said it would be clearing 2 squares, closing city parks and sidewalks that surround them. And this is within a block or two of the Hatfield Federal Courthouse. The people who were camping out in the park were given 10 minutes to leave, and according to eyewitnesses, they did comply. People literally got up, started stumbling out of the park. There was no resistance. The people just moved out. And so they have been blocked off with police tape, and we're told that this is setting the stage for the entry of the Oregon State Police, who will now be managing security in downtown Portland and taking over from the federal goon squad. So we'll see how all this works out, but that is the outline of what is expected at this point. In the show file for today's podcast, I've linked to an analytical piece from the Oregonian newspaper where they're trying to figure out how Governor Kate Brown was able to persuade the feds to pull out. And the Kate Brown administration says that it turned out to be relatively easy because the Trump administration was clearly looking for a way out. Trump administration officials did not demand any concessions or pledges from Brown before they agreed that their officers would depart. That's according to her chief of staff. Now, he said they're not going to walk in and say, we screwed up, but every action they took in the last week implied that they needed a different strategy. Federal and state officials started to discuss the drawdown late last week, after a federal judge temporarily barred those federal officers from using force, threats, and orders against journalists and legal observers. And the judge in that case, Michael Simon, who I've just learned here is married to Democratic Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, rejected the federal government's argument that officers shooting journalists and legal observers were unintended consequences of crowd control. He wrote, "When wrongdoing is underway, the officials have great incentive to blindfold the eyes of the Fourth Estate. The free press is the guardian of the public interest, and the judiciary is the guardian of the press." Meanwhile, there is dissension, and the wall of moms appears to be crumbling. Now, this gets into what I consider to be some pretty petty stuff. But here it is. The Portland Wall of Moms, a group formed in recent weeks and recognized for their role in the downtown protests, was accused Wednesday of anti-blackness by leaders of an existing black-led community group who had been recruited by the white women who founded the Wall of Moms, who appeared to be persuaded by the argument that people of color should be in charge. Now, as we pointed out, Portland is one of the whitest major cities in the United States, over 75%. The black population is around 6%. And so what we're told here is that one of the white women founders of the Wall of Moms, without telling the black women that they had recruited to take over leadership, filed with the Oregon Secretary of State to, essentially license the Wall of Moms as a 501c3 nonprofit. And this led the group called Don't Shoot Portland to attack the founders of the Wall of Moms. So they posted, none of the black leadership of WOM claimed to implement, none of the black leadership that WOM claimed to implement knew about this. Combined with the lack of care for black women, we were used to further the agenda unrelated to Black Lives Matter. So it's difficult for me to try to arbitrate this from a distance and based on a news account here. But this kind of squabbling, to me, is really disappointing. And I don't know the motives of the white women who filed to get control of those names. I don't know why they didn't notify the black leaders from Don't Shoot Portland, who they had installed as the new leaders of the Wall of Moms. But that is the state of play, and I'm sorry that it's gotten ugly. In Seattle today, Mayor Durkin and the police chief Carmen Best held a news conference, and from my point of view, it appears they grossly exaggerated items that were found in a van that was impounded after some protests that were partially violent last Saturday in Seattle. And in particular, there was an incident at the East Precinct where somebody used some sort of explosives to punch a hole in a wall. So a mysterious white van was seen in the area. A witness told police they had seen baseball bats and explosives inside that same van earlier in the day, and after the cops grabbed it, they got a search warrant. They discovered firework pyrotechnics, smoke bombs, stun guns, bear and pepper spray, makeshift spike strips, and gas masks. But the mayor and the police chief called them explosives. Now, fireworks are, I guess, explosive. Is a stun gun an explosive? Well, to me, these are the less lethal tools of protesters who are confronting the militarized police in Seattle. And I don't know who benefits from this kind of exaggeration. Mayor Durkin is facing a recall led by people who've been protesting for racial justice and police accountability. She tried to get that dismissed, and yesterday, the King County judge who ruled that the petition could proceed stood by her decision. There's an excellent piece at The Intercept today under the byline of Alice Sperry, and at 20 pages or so, she makes a strong case for dismantling the Department of Homeland Security. And once again, at the risk of annoying you, I never repeat things as much as Rachel Maddow, I promise. But I will repeat that I hate the name Homeland Security. And if they make any changes with this huge department, it's the third largest agency in the U.S. government, it should start by renaming it. But there's also a good case to be argued that it should be broken up. DHS has more than 60,000 law enforcement agents, nearly half the total number of federal law enforcement people. They oversee 24 sub-agencies and offices, annual budget of $50 billion. They run those fusion centers that really bug me. I refer to that as the vertical integration of law enforcement. And all of this was erected during the Bush administration, who had promised during the 2000 campaign that they wanted to shrink government. But they created this sprawling, ineffective, and inefficient agency. And, unfortunately, we haven't seen much appetite in Congress to take on a task like this. Yesterday, I reported that Ted Lieu of California and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York are co-sponsoring an amendment that would cut off funding for the worst tactics used by elements of the Homeland Security apparatus. But so far, nobody is talking about a top-to-bottom review with an eye toward dismantling the agency as it is today. And the Intercept article liberally quotes the libertarian Cato Institute's Director of Immigration Studies, Alex Nowrasteh. Their unaccountability, the violence of the policies they're carrying out, and the violence with which they are now doing it is more known and understood by more people than ever before. The latest deployment of Homeland Security and especially Customs and Border Patrol officers going into American cities without the request of local political authorities is incredibly disturbing. It's like a novel written by a libertarian about the encroaching powers of federal law enforcement. Now, some of the same people who want to dismantle DHS also want to eliminate ICE. And the argument that I will make in return is that we're always going to have agencies performing these tasks. But reorganizations, shuffling, redefinition of the missions of specific agencies are things that I will never oppose. I just don't like people to go off on a bender on something that's totally impractical, like saying abolish ICE. Because we live in a country that will always have some sort of armed immigration gendarmes. So according to Matt Stoller, who is opinionating over at The Guardian today, and I've talked to Matt once or twice in the past, he's a bit controversial, but he knows what he's talking about when it comes to Silicon Valley. And he referred to yesterday's remote hearings that included Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, and Sundar Pichai of Google as a glorious sight. Well, I saw a bunch of members of Congress of both parties using the scene for political posturing with a whole lot of hot talk. And some of that hot talk was accurate. It was critical. But there is no regulatory proposal that is on the table. There is vague talk of antitrust action. Oh, that might force Facebook to sell off Instagram. But I don't see any proposals to protect our privacy, to restrict the growth of these companies, the exploitation of the data that they collect from us, the anti-competitive actions of Amazon and Google, which are pretty obvious. These outfits are too big to jail, and they pump too much money into political campaigns and lobbying for Washington to really take any critical action against them. And as the betting line seems to improve for Kamala Harris as Joe Biden's pick for VP candidate, well, David Sirota, in his newsletter today, offers some important context about Kamala Harris. He notes that during the 2020 election, her record on criminal justice proved too steep a hurdle during the campaign. She was dogged by criticism that as California Attorney General, she had been soft on white-collar crime like mortgage fraud. She accepted contributions from Steve Mnuchin, the foreclosure king, instead of prosecuting him. And what Sirota exposes is her cozy connections to top Silicon Valley companies. As far back as 2010, that's 10 years ago when she ran for Attorney General, she was making public statements against antitrust enforcement against big tech. Just before her first election as AG, she went over to Google for a free lunch, and boy, do they have great lunch there. I don't know what it's like today because people aren't working on the campus as much, but I've been to Google for lunch, and it's fabulous. You got your choice of all you can eat in 5 different cuisines at any given moment. Anyway, she sat down with the senior VP, Dave Drummond. He asked her about antitrust enforcement in the tech industry. She said, well, that would be short-sighted. We have to allow these businesses to develop and grow. We can't stand in the way of business growth and development. I think she just said the same thing twice in a different order. Drummond asked Harris about her views on data privacy. She said that a balance had to be struck. And she dodged the question by pivoting to the safety of children using the internets. 3 years later, in another appearance, she enthusiastically singled out Airbnb and Uber, 2 companies whose industry disruption involved skirting regulations imposed on the traditional hotel and taxi competitors. And a recent article noted that Harris's office had failed to act to prevent Facebook's acquisition of Instagram in 2012 and WhatsApp in 2014. And she participated in a promotional video for Facebook's chief operating officer, Sheryl Sandberg, when she launched her book about women in power in 2013 called Lean In. So you get the picture. And we shall see. Joe Biden says next week he will announce his pick for vice president. Well, today is the final day of tributes to John Lewis. At the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, a funeral was held today, and lots of great speechifying. The New York Times also published a column that was written by John Lewis shortly before he died, where he said that Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 at that time. He writes, ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed you can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching, existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, And that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe, because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, John Lewis wrote, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart. Stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. And I'll note that Trump's desperate idea of shifting Election Day occurred here on the day when a man who fought for voting rights is being eulogized. So in Washington, D.C., the entire federal appeals court bench has taken up the case in the trial of Mike Flynn, which was at the sentencing phase in the courtroom of Emmett Sullivan when Bill Barr intervened to drop the charges. And I know my position on this is a little confusing for people, so I'll clarify. It was Scott Ritter who persuaded me that Bill Barr did have a technical basis to dismiss or move to dismiss the charges against Mike Flynn. You can listen to that in my podcast interview with Ritter, which is not behind the paywall anymore. You can grab it even if you're not a subscriber at peterbcollins.com. At the same time, the way the three-judge panel of the D.C. Appeals Court intervened prematurely and ordered Judge Sullivan that he had to dismiss those charges under a writ of mandamus. Well, the full appeals court has dissolved that. They vacated the June 24th decision ordering the immediate dismissal of the case, and they have set oral arguments before the full court for August 11th. In another courtroom, a federal judge in New York blocked the Trump administration from enforcing a policy during the pandemic that allows the government to deny permanent residency to immigrants who officials believe are likely to use public benefits. This is a cruel measure, and it's based on Trump's idea that only wealthy immigrants should be permitted in the United States. And so it's means testing, and it is mean, people for citizenship. And it gets into all the tropes about anchor babies and, immigrants who suck benefits from the American system that they don't deserve. But when you take the big picture view, immigrants get taxed on their income and other activities, but they never get to file for a refund. And immigrants pay a lot of taxes. And so I think that it's cruel and short-sighted to try to look at a narrow issue. So the judge in this case, who is George Daniels, wrote, doctors and other medical personnel, state and local officials, and staff at nonprofit organizations have all witnessed immigrants refusing to enroll in Medicaid or other public-funded health coverage, foregoing testing and treatment for COVID-19, out of fear that accepting such insurance or care will increase their risk of being labeled a public charge. As a direct result of the rule, immigrants are forced to make an impossible choice between jeopardizing health and personal safety or their immigration status, and he is imposing a ban or a block that is in effect for any period during which there's a national health emergency in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. Over at Shadowproof, Kevin Gostola takes a look at some of the ironies of honoring whistleblowers here on National Whistleblower Appreciation Day. And he also did a live stream with John Kiriakou, where, number one, they honored whistleblowers who are not so well known, but also Kiriakou boycotted the online conference that's being held today in Washington by the National Whistleblower Center because one of their speakers is a former government official who was quite hostile to whistleblowers. And Gostola makes an important distinction here, that the whistleblower community, which is lawyers and organizations like POGO and the National Whistleblower Center, they often don't recognize the true whistleblowers like Ed Snowden, like the NSA whistleblowers from Bill Binney to Tom Drake to Russell Tice, and there are others. They don't consider Kiriakou to be a legitimate whistleblower. They exclude national security and the disclosure of classified information from their sanitized definition of who is a legitimate whistleblower. And that puts them on the same page with people like Senator Chuck Grassley, the Republican, who is described as a big friend of whistleblowers, but every whistleblower I've talked to who went to Chuck Grassley got screwed. So I've linked to Gostola's piece, and you're welcome to read it. It's in the show file at peterbcollins.com. Shahid Buttar is the man who's challenging Nancy Pelosi for her congressional seat here in San Francisco. He picked up 13% of the vote in the primary and will be on the ballot against her in November. And as you know, we've covered it here. He has been accused of sexual harassment, not sexual assault, by a Washington-based woman and a comedian named Elizabeth Croydon. And they ran in the same circles almost 20 years ago. Now, what is important to note is that Croydon has only accused Shahid Buttar of conveying messages that he was sexually available to her. So he flirted, he expressed interest, if those terms can be explained that way. She has not accused him of any unwanted sexual activities of a physical nature. And she seems to be a very sensitive individual who's got her own set of problems. And so, in a lengthy piece under the byline of Fiorella Isabel, a lot of these issues are aired out. I commend it to you for a read. It's interesting because Fiorella Isabel suggests that Ms. Croydon, by saying that Buttar would not be a good candidate for office because of their uncomfortable interactions almost 20 years ago, well, then Isabel makes her own political statements about her criticisms of Nancy Pelosi, and she's entitled to them. Most of them are legitimate. But what is new here is a series of tweets from Elizabeth Croydon. And in a series of them, she tries to link Shahid Buttar's sexual harassment with the behavior of an unnamed friend, a hip-hop artist, who spit on Elizabeth Croydon, threw her into a wall, and she says it caused her to lose years of memory and have to fight her way back to being able to walk. So I don't know the nature of that incident. She doesn't suggest that Buttar was complicit, just that he is a friend of this former gangbanger and rapper who threw her into a wall, disabling her for years. So it appears she has a history of these types of complaints. She once accused Kevin Zeese, a man I know and respect, of sexually harassing her. And it surfaced at a time that Zeese was running for the Senate, I believe, in Maryland. And Kevin's longtime partner, Margaret Flowers, tweeted, "I know Shahid and I know Elizabeth. I have total respect for Shahid. I have no respect for Elizabeth after she falsely accused my partner of sexual assault in 2006 when he ran for office." So she is a serial accuser. Now, this piece also takes up the report by The Intercept of workplace harassment in the Buttar campaign, and women who complained that they were not heard. And I have to say that I cannot directly evaluate these. I wasn't in the room, but I've worked on campaigns. They are chaotic. And particularly when you interact the paid staffers with volunteers, there's a lot of jockeying for the ear of the candidate, for trying to, contribute that great idea for an ad or a rally or a protest or an issue that you're going to take up. And so it's very hard to evaluate the comments of the people who no longer work on the Buttar campaign. And for me, it's just tragic because I've long admired Shahid, and he is definitely being smeared. Is there a basis for these smears? Well, related to Elizabeth Croydon, it seems extremely thin. And related to the staff changes, it's hard to say that those are fully substantiated. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, we're now showing over 17 million confirmed cases of COVID-19. The total death count is 668,000. Across the United States, confirmed cases 4.4 million. Total deaths now 151,451. And yesterday, we had at least 1,420 new coronavirus deaths, 68,000 new cases. Over the past week, there have been an average of 65,000 cases per day, an increase of 3% from just 2 weeks before. And that 1,400 number keeps creeping up. We've lost 1,000 people a day for the past week or longer. And we don't see any kind of a downturn in those numbers in sight right now. A research team based at Harvard and the Illinois Institute of Technology studied the ways that COVID-19 was transmitted on the Diamond Princess cruise ship and concluded that the virus spread most readily in microscopic droplets that were light enough to float in the air for several minutes or much longer. Their new paper hasn't been peer-reviewed, and if confirmed, the findings would have major implications for making indoor spaces safer and choosing among a panoply of personal protective gear. Herman Cain, age 74, ran for president in 2012. He was famous for his 999 economic plan, or it was a tax plan, something like that. And just 9 days after he attended the Trump indoor campaign rally in Tulsa on June 20th, he tested positive for the coronavirus and was admitted to an Atlanta hospital a couple of days later. Now, I cannot clinically state that Herman Cain got the virus at Trump's rally, but it appears extremely likely. And I heard Rush Limbaugh this morning trying to inoculate his listeners against any blame for Trump for holding this rally, for allowing a 74-year-old man to show up there. He was seen in pictures not wearing a mask. He claimed that at times he did wear a mask that day. But even after he was in the hospital, Herman Cain was tweeting against masks. And I always found him to be kind of a crazy guy. Entertaining, that's for sure. And when I looked at Facebook this morning, my friend Nancy Walton said, Herman Cain hasn't died. He's just gone to Uzbekistan. And if you don't get that joke, I can't explain it to you, okay? So as a result of Louis Gohmert's positive test for COVID-19 and the fact that he was roaming the halls of Congress, hanging out in committee rooms, talking to the Attorney General, all without a mask, Nancy Pelosi has mandated the wearing of face masks in the House. Members and staff will be required to wear masks in the halls of the House. Members and staffers will not be allowed in the House chamber if they refuse to obey the new mandate. Representative Kay Granger, who sat next to Gohmert on a flight from Texas to Washington, is self-quarantining, and Texas Republican Congressman Chip Roy says he will not be isolating, despite his recent interactions with Louis. This week, tech platforms deleted a video retweeted by Trump that featured 7 doctors who claimed their frontline knowledge of the pandemic contradicts the guidance of public health experts. The group, calling itself America's Frontline Doctors, touted alleged benefits of hydroxychloroquine as a cure for COVID-19. One of them, named Jenny Beth Martin, a co-founder of Tea Party Patriots, said, "These are the doctors diagnosing, treating, and helping patients beat COVID-19. But according to USA Today, it's unclear to what extent the doctors have such experience. Most are physicians with active state medical licenses, but their specialties and experience suggest they were offering little more than personal opinions, as opposed to research experience on infectious diseases. While one is affiliated with a hospital that would treat critically ill patients and others work at urgent care or other clinics, none claim to be infectious disease experts or doctors working in a hospital emergency room." A director of the Harvard Global Health Institute, Ashish Jha, said the idea that any doctor's personal experience could outweigh more rigorous studies is simply unscientific. Some of the allegations made in their video, including that a cure for COVID-19 exists, essentially suggest a global conspiracy to suppress an effective treatment to the coronavirus, and Jha said it's not science. An analysis by the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel found that many hydroxychloroquine trials have resembled lone wolf research, overseen by individual hospitals and universities, and have become a frenzied hodgepodge of undertakings. Dr. Anthony Fauci responded as well, saying the only recourse to the video is to be very clear in presenting the scientific data that essentially contradicts that. Appearing on MSNBC with Andrea Mitchell for the first time since April, Fauci said that he was asked about how damaging Trump's endorsement of hydroxychloroquine, or HCQ, was. "The only thing that I can do, Andrea, is to do what I've done all along consistently, is you look at the scientific data and the evidence. And the data, the cumulative data on trials, clinical trials that were valid, namely clinical trials that were randomized and controlled in the proper way, all of those trials showed consistently that hydroxychloroquine is not effective in the treatment of coronavirus disease or COVID-19. Now, I have respect for Dr. Fauci, but I do not consider him infallible. I don't have much respect for, I'm blocking on her name, the doctor from Texas. I think it's Isabel something. At any rate, I do believe that there is honest controversy about the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine. But I don't approve of the stifling of any discussion of hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for COVID-19 and the way the media is building consensus that anybody who espouses the use of hydroxychloroquine is crazy. This is very dangerous, and it stifles any kind of scientific exploration. Now, Linda wrote the text that I just read to you, and she also sent me an article from, this is a North State Journal, and I don't know much about it, but it writes about the test that was conducted through May at the Henry Ford Hospital System in Detroit. And they report in a peer-reviewed large-scale retrospective analysis of 2,500 patients, 13% of those treated with hydroxychloroquine alone died, compared to 26% who were not treated with hydroxychloroquine. None of the patients had documented serious heart abnormalities, which is the side effect we're told about related to hydroxychloroquine with COVID-19. All patients in the study were 18 or over. 82% of the patients received the drug within 24 hours of diagnosis. And what it shows is that there is some efficacy here. And I'm not a scientist. I cannot be the final arbiter of this dispute. And as I've said before, just because Trump has touted it and continues to do so, should not bias us to the point where we have to embrace the alternate orthodoxy. Another Republican joins Herman Cain in passing away due to the coronavirus. This is Bill Montgomery, the co-founder of Turning Point USA. And he has been unequivocal. At the age of 80, he said just this past Sunday, "Do not force me to wear a mask. It's that simple. I'm not going to do it. I'm not. Every single time I go into one of those grocery stores, where's your mask?" I say, well, first of all, the science around masks is very questionable. Now, this is an issue that I don't find controversial. I think people who claim, like this guy does, that the mask actually puts you at greater risk because you're breathing in your own exhaust, well, that's not sensible to me. Because, as we've been told, the purpose of the mask is to keep my exhaust from infecting you. Because if I'm already infected, it doesn't matter if I'm breathing my own exhaust. And I also think that there is some awareness that is fostered to be careful not to touch your eyes or your nose when you haven't washed your hands recently. And so there may be an element of social engineering in the mandates and pressure to wear masks these days. But I don't consider it a plot linked to one world government or an effort to force us to submit to further indignations. I just feel that some people go pretty much off the reservation when they get into some of these arguments. Here in California, despite a moratorium on evictions, landlords are finding ways to squeeze people out. Some of them threaten to turn off the water. Others resort to angry voicemail messages. And we are facing, because California housing is already so expensive, even though there have been some declines in rents in some of the highest priced areas because the demand is declining. But we are looking at wave after wave of evictions and foreclosures. And I didn't see anything about this in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, but the Guardian, all the way from London, I think is doing a good job of focusing on the very real risks that we're facing. Yesterday, I mentioned that the Treasury Department has extended a $10 billion loan to the U.S. Postal Service. And at Consortium News, they run an article by Jake Johnson of Common Dreams, where he expresses concern that the terms of this loan have led leading congressional Democrats to worry that it could accelerate the demise of the Postal Service by giving the administration unprecedented access to the internal operations of the agency. So a group of Democrats issued that warning in a statement released last night. And part of the terms of this loan package is that the Treasury Department gets to look at the inner workings of the post office, and in particular, the private sector shipping contracts that Trump is so concerned about because he thinks that his archenemy, Jeff Bezos, is getting too good a deal from the post office. And the article also reports that a number of local post offices have suddenly restricted their operating hours without any real announcement, just a sign in the window. Over at Mid-Press News, Raul Diego gives a good update on General Khalifa Haftar. Depending on how it's translated, he's sometimes called Hifter. He was a loyalist of Muammar Gaddafi. And after Gaddafi was snuffed out, when the U.S. led from behind in the Libyan operation, as they put it at the time, well, Haftar showed up running an army and claiming to be one of the legitimate leaders of Libya. Well, according to Mint Press, Haftar has been meeting routinely with members of Israel's Mossad, and they appear to be secretly backing him. Now, he also gets a lot of support from the rich Arab nations, including the United Arab Emirates. And Mint Press also reports that he has been getting support from Iran. Now, this is a guy who appeared to be a U.S. asset because after he was booted out of Libya, he spent 15 or 20 years living down the road from CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. So he's quite an operator. If he can get Israel, Arab nations, and Iran all to support him, that's pretty amazing. Have you seen any pictures of this public art that is on the streets of Tel Aviv right now? It's called Netanyahu's Last Supper. And it shows him with bottles of champagne and cigars and a huge cake that he's picking at. And it is satirizing the reasons that he is being charged and tried for corruption. He accepted a lot of expensive gifts from rich friends. Ever the victim, though, Benjamin Netanyahu denounced the display, saying there was no place for incitement and death threats against him. I don't believe there's a death threat here, including the disgraceful threat of crucifixion in Tel Aviv. Well, the artist, whose name is Zalait, let's see if I can get his first name from the article here. Oh, I can't quite find it. At any rate, he said, everyone hopes this is really Bibi's Last Supper. The corruption and disgust are suggested by the disgusting abundance of so much food with meat and milk and cream and sweets. So take that. Scientists believe they have made a breakthrough. And they think they're going to be able to trace the source of the stones at Stonehenge. They've been analyzing a 3.5-foot cylindrical core, and they believe that it came from, they can't specify the exact location, but an area in Britain not far from Stonehenge. I still want to know how they got the rocks piled up the way they did. I always felt it was some sort of a stone-throwing fight by giants. And finally today, here in sedate Marin County, in the middle of the night, officials authorized the removal of a 30-foot statue that is said to be of the explorer Sir Francis Drake. But the artist who made the statue never named it Drake or said that. It was a conclusion reached by city officials when they installed this many years ago. So, amid the effort to rename racist military base names and remove statues of racist figures and Confederate leaders, here in California, we are taking down and sanitizing a high school. There's a move afoot to change the name of Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. And I'm not an expert on the history of Drake, and I don't have a deep investment in this. But I feel that there are many self-righteous people with limited knowledge of history. And from what I know of Drake, he did participate in the slave trade early on in his work as a ship's captain. But he repudiated slavery. He reportedly got along well with native tribes, treated tribal individuals as human, took them on some of his expeditions. But to me, the most significant issue is that this was over 500 years ago. And how do we evaluate that history in a current context? And so I don't oppose orderly processes of renaming places. People can pick any name they want for any place they want. But I just feel like this is a somewhat gratuitous effort to keep up with, well, it's not Joneses, but something like that. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. Even send it to Sir Francis Drake. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.